Hello, and welcome to this presentation on Invoicing Workflows. I'm Carrie Bartels, and I'm a trainer with Ex Libris North America. Note that this presentation is copyrighted and is the confidential property of Ex Libris Limited. You may share these training materials within your institution, but not beyond. In this session, we will focus on the invoicing workflows that are available in ALMA. We'll follow the process from the creation of an invoice through processing, where the invoice can be reviewed, approved, and paid. Before viewing this session, we do recommend that you view the sessions that are listed here to give you a good background in navigating and searching functionality, as well as acquisitions in general. Additionally, it will be important to have knowledge of fund management in ALMA, since funds are very related to invoices. The key objectives for this session are to understand how the invoice process works within ALMA and the options that are available to you within the workflow, be able to create and review invoices, approve invoices as needed, and understand the process to pay invoices. There are specific roles in ALMA for acquisitions invoicing tasks, and these roles will be used in the workflows that we cover in this session. Note that the invoice operator role can be paired with the invoice operator extended role, so that the operator can not only create and review invoices, but also additionally be able to delete or cancel invoices. Also, one of the invoicing options that we'll look at is whether you want to do receiving immediately after creating the invoice. In order to receive material, a staff operator must also have the receiving operator role in the appropriate receiving department. Before we discuss the invoice creation process, let's just take some time to go over the workflow and look at some considerations to think about when implementing the workflow. The ALMA invoicing workflow governs the way that an invoice is handled, from the point of its creation to the point at which the invoice is paid. Invoices essentially track payments for resources. And just a few things to mention about the workflow. Invoices may be created in several ways, either manually, so for example from a purchase order or importing an Excel file, or processed automatically via electronic data interchange, or EDI, from the vendor. There's also an option where you can handle receiving immediately after creating the invoice. Payments can be exported to a financial system, in other words, an ERP or Enterprise Resource Planning system at your institution. The session on synchronizing with ERP systems will cover the ERP and invoice workflow integration in more detail. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the invoicing process can be flexible depending on your needs. And I'll point out the options as we look at the workflow. There are some things to consider when looking at the invoicing workflow and thinking about the options that you want to implement. At your institution, for example, are you able to export or import invoices to and from an ERP system? Do you use electronic data interchange for invoicing? How are invoicing activities handled at your institution? By more than one operator, or does one staff operator handle the entire invoicing workflow? And do you currently have an approval process for invoices before they go to a payment stage? Now, we'll talk about these more in depth as we go, but I just wanted to mention them here as things to start thinking about. ALMA has invoice review and approval rules that allow these scenarios to be employed. And what is configured will depend very much on what you currently do for invoicing or what you're able to do at your institution. And so you'll want to discuss this with your Ex Libris project team, how ALMA invoicing should be configured for you. This diagram shows the general invoicing workflow in ALMA. And the boxes that have dotted lines indicate steps where no action is needed by staff because they're system-related statuses. The options that are available within the workflow will be explained shortly. So the first step is we need to create the invoice, and there are several options for how to do this. So for example, either manually from a PO, uploading an Excel file with the invoice data, or automatically creating the invoice using EDI from the vendor. Invoices are processed according to rules that are configured in ALMA to determine whether or not there are elements that require special attention. Any issues that require attention, such as missing or incorrect data, will send the invoice to a review status. Now, in the review stage of the workflow, this allows a staff operator to correct or add any missing information to the invoice. There are invoice review rules that can be configured in ALMA to require a review of all invoices before moving to the next step, or to just review invoices in certain circumstances. And it's just a matter of how your invoicing department operates. So you'll want to work with your Ex Libris project team to get these rules initially set up. After the invoice is reviewed and edited as needed, the invoice is then reprocessed to determine if there are elements still requiring attention. If data issues are still present, the invoice returns to the review stage. If all data issues have been resolved, the invoice then proceeds to the next step, which is the approval stage. Now for the approval stage, this is actually an optional stage. Invoices can be either automatically approved behind the scenes and sent to the payment stage of the workflow, or they can await manual approval before the workflow can be continued. There are approval rules that can be configured, very similar to review rules, that can be configured to indicate how you want to handle invoicing approvals. And again, as with invoicing review rules, you'll initially want to work with your Ex Libris project team to get those approval rules configured as needed. If the approval rules determine that the invoice can be approved automatically, it moves then to the payment stages, which we'll talk about shortly. If, however, approval rules determine that manual approval is required, the invoice is sent to the approval stage at that point. And it's at this point that manual approval would happen by an invoicing manager, so that the invoice can be sent to the payment system at that point if they do approve the invoice. If the manager rejects the invoice, it's returned back to the payment stage. Alternatively, if the item was prepaid or if the invoice is just more of an internal copy to track the item, the invoice goes from the create invoice, possibly the review status, and possibly the review status, then automatically to the paid stage. And this is behind the scenes. No action is needed by staff here. And then it's closed out by ALMA. And this assumes, again, that there are no data issues that would require attention that would put the invoice back into a review stage. So once the invoice actually reaches the payment stage, it awaits payment processing using your institution's bill payment system. Now, behind the scenes, the status of the invoice in ALMA will be ready to be paid. No action is needed by staff here. Then it moves to a waiting for payment status, where you would manually input the voucher number on the invoice. At that point, once that's done, the invoice will be in a paid status behind the scenes. Again, no action needed by staff here. Lastly, ALMA always checks to see that the invoice line, or the PO lines rather, that are associated with the invoice, that those PO lines are fully invoiced and paid. So once ALMA confirms this, both the invoice and the PO lines are closed out. So just to review the various workflow options, you can decide, first of all, how you want to create the invoice. You can decide how you want the review stage to work. So for example, should all invoices be put into a review status, or just invoices that may have data issues under certain circumstances? You can decide how you want the approval stage to work. Should all invoices be just automatically approved behind the scenes? Or do you want a manual approval to take place in certain situations where an invoicing manager would need to provide approval before the invoice can move to the next step? And then lastly, while it's not actually mentioned in the workflow itself, do you want to do receiving immediately after creating the invoice? So now that we've talked about the invoice workflow options, let's talk about the invoice creation process. An invoice can be created in one of four ways. It can be created manually, where you indicate PO lines that should be associated with the invoice. It can be done manually from a PO using the details in the PO. It can be manually imported using an Excel spreadsheet that contains the appropriate vendor invoice details. Or it can be done automatically using electronic data interchange invoice messages from the vendor. So to create an invoice manually, we begin by going to the Acquisitions menu under Receiving and Invoicing, and we can click on the Create Invoice link. And this takes us to the invoice creation process page where we select how we want to create that invoice. So let's go to ALMA. So from the ALMA Acquisitions menu, under Receiving and Invoicing, I'm going to click on Create Invoice. So for this first example, we're going to use the manual creation process, and this actually will be selected for us by default. Also for this example, we are going to choose not to handle receiving. Now if we did select the handle receiving checkbox, it would allow us to do receiving right after the invoice is created. And for this option, you'll need to make sure that you additionally have the role of receiving operator and that you're logged into the correct acquisitions department where you're currently at location. So if you use this option to handle receiving, as soon as the invoice is created, you'll then be automatically taken to the receiving area in ALMA to do receiving of the item. So for this example, though, we are going to choose not to handle receiving. And I'll click on the next button. And this will actually create the invoice for us. So the invoice details screen displays, and there are 4 main sections. So just some general invoice details, additional charges, VAT, which is tax related, and then a payment section where you can indicate, for example, if something is prepaid. So starting from the top, the first field that we'll see here is for the invoice number, and this can be the invoice number that the vendor sends us. So let me just type in an invoice number here. The date of the invoice, we need to select that. The total amount, this is the total invoice amount, and a negative amount can be entered here to indicate a credit invoice, like for example if something has been already prepaid. So let me indicate an amount here. When I do that, we will see the total invoice lines amount field display, and I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. The vendor, so we select the vendor here, so we can type in the vendor code, or we can use the magnifying glass to search for the vendor. And then we'll also indicate the vendor account. The vendor contact person, this is the contact person at the vendor who would perhaps deal with this invoice. And this does require that the contact person is included in the vendor record. So any contact people who are in that vendor record, they will display in the drop-down menu. And then invoice reference number, this is a reference number for the invoice, which can be used to enable grouping of invoices for reporting purposes. And then the last field we'll see up towards the top here is the payment method, and you'll see the different options here. Just a note that if accounting department is selected, you will not be able to select prepaid in the payment section, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Moving to the additional charges section, when needed, additional charges or discounts can be applied to an invoice. And if the charges or discounts should apply to each of the invoice lines, we can use this pro rata checkbox to make that happen. So when I click on that, notice several fields display here. So these will be fields for additional charges. So what you enter for additional charges, so for example, a shipment amount or insurance amount, those additional charges will be distributed amongst each of the order lines in the invoice. So in other words, prorated for each order line in the invoice. In this example, we're going to choose not to use pro rata. And in VAT, the VAT section, just in brief, this is used to handle VAT or GST or other taxes in invoices. And we'll go into more detail on applying taxes to invoices in the invoicing and tax session. And then lastly, the payment section contains details, for example, on whether an item is prepaid. While we're talking about this prepaid option, let's actually go into a little bit more detail here. In the case where an item has been prepaid and you're just using ALMA for reference or tracking purposes, the prepaid option becomes active only if a payment method other than accounting department is selected. So let's say, for example, I'm going to select cash as the payment method. Notice that this allows me then to select the prepaid checkbox. So when I select that checkbox, I will see a payment status appear. So I can select paid as the status. I can enter the voucher number, the date of the voucher, and then the amount of the voucher. You can enter a negative number here to indicate a credit. So when using the prepaid option, the invoice automatically closes after the invoice is created unless an alert forces the invoice to the review stage. Now also, from time to time, you will see in the payment area an option for internal copy. And I'm actually going to show you this on the slides. Typically you will see this in that area in the payment section. The option for internal copy is used for informational purposes only, with the intention of tracking that an invoice was loaded into ALMA. So when internal copy is selected, you'll notice these same boxes appear that appeared for prepaid. And so when you do select internal copy, the invoice will automatically be closed after we create it, very similar to prepaid. So once all of the invoice line details are entered, and let's go back to ALMA. So we've entered everything. I'm just going to change this back to accounting department. Then we need to click on Save and Create Invoice Lines, and that will take us to the next step. So here is the entire invoice. We'll see different tabs across the top, and we're taken to the Invoice Lines tab. So this is where we need to associate the PO lines or the order lines that are associated with this invoice. So to do that, we click on Add Invoice Line. This opens up a new window. And the first thing we need to do is select the type of invoice line. Regular refers to regular invoice lines. All other types that you see here in this drop-down refer to additional charges. Now, if you remember back, if pro rata, if that checkbox was selected when we initially created this invoice, additional charges are prorated against each of the invoice lines. So in that case, the only options that you will see in this type drop-down will be regular and other. And that's because we would have already entered the additional charges information on the previous screen when we selected that pro rata checkbox. If you did not select the pro rata checkbox, the additional charges are not allocated to a specific invoice line. They're actually, any additional charges are allocated to the invoice in general. So we select regular for this example, and then we need to select the PO line. So in this PO line field, we can enter the PO line number, or we can perhaps enter the title of the item, or we can click on the magnifying glass, and that will display PO lines, and let's go ahead and do that. Notice that the search results that we see here will only be active, in other words, PO lines that are waiting for an invoice that are from Baker & Taylor, the vendor that we indicated in the invoice. So for now, I'm just going to click on Cancel. And I happen to know the PO line number, so I'm just going to type that in. Or again, I could start typing in the title, and that would bring up the PO line as well. So notice when I type that PO line number in, information from that PO line automatically populates here for the invoice line. However, you can make changes as you need to. So just to give you a couple examples here, if, for example, the fund needs to change, you can do that here. You can perhaps delete this fund and add a different fund instead, or perhaps add a fund in addition to this fund and split the amount that will be taken from each fund. Another example, perhaps the amount that was invoiced is different than originally planned. So for that, you can just change the price that you see here, and also be sure to change the price for the fund, the amount that will be taken from the fund. Also, as I scroll back up, just a note that you can indicate if the item is fully invoiced, or you can select no if you expect that another invoice will be created for the remaining amount. So in this case, we will say that yes, this is fully invoiced. So once this information is correct, you can click on either Add or Add and Close. And the difference between the two, Add will add this invoice line and then quickly allow you to add another invoice line or another invoice order line to the invoice. Clicking on Add and Close will add this invoice line and then return you to the Invoice Lines tab of the invoice. So we'll go ahead and do that. So I'll click on Add and Close. So we're taken back to our invoice in the Invoice Lines tab, and here we see the details for this invoice line. Again, this is just automatically populated from the PO line. However, you can make changes at any point by clicking on Actions, Edit. So at this point, you can add more lines to the invoice, clicking on the Add Invoice Line button. You can add charges, additional charges, to the invoice, and this will be applicable for the entire invoice, not necessarily prorated for each invoice line. You can add discounts as you need to. You can also add notes and attachments as you need to the invoice. And once the invoice is completed, you would click on Save and Continue to have Alma take the invoice through a validation process to make sure that no information is missing. Clicking on Save means that the invoice will stay in a review status. So I'll go ahead and click on Save and Continue. And then it's in a payment status at this point, and we'll talk about the payment statuses in just a moment. So just a note that when the invoice line is added to the invoice, the amount that was previously encumbered for the PO lines fund is disencumbered at that point. And if you go to the fund itself, you'll see this disencumbrance in the Transactions tab, and it will then turn into an expenditure. Keep this in mind. We'll look at it in Alma shortly. So this is a manual process for creating an invoice and then adding invoice lines. So at this point, let's go back to the slides, and let's look at the second option for creating an invoice. And this is creating the invoice from a PO. So we're going to go back to Alma. And if I go under Acquisitions, Receiving and Invoicing, I'm going to click on Create Invoice again. But this time I'm going to select the second option from PO. And I'll click on the Next button. So this is where we need to enter the PO number in the Select PO field. Now, just for reference purposes, this is not the PO line number, but the PO number. So you would enter the PO number here, or click on the magnifying glass, and that allows you to find and select the PO from a list of purchase orders. So I'm going to use the drop down here in the Find field, and I don't happen to have the PO line number with, or PO number with me, but I do happen to have the PO line number. So I'm going to find the PO based on the PO line. So here's my PO line number, and here is the PO associated with it. So I'll click on Select. So just confirmation that this is a PO from Baker and Taylor, and I then need to click on the Save button, and that will create the invoice. So here's the invoice, and we're automatically put into the Invoice Lines tab. So invoices are, of course, created using PO lines. And invoice line field will, again, either be filled in automatically, as we see in this example here. Everything's been filled in for me based on the PO, and it will display in the Invoice Lines tab. And as always, you can edit as you need to by clicking on Actions, Edit. Perhaps the fund needs to change, or perhaps the price for the item has changed. The amount of the invoice lines in total, the amount here needs to be the same as the invoice amount that's in the Summary tab. So when you click on the Save and Continue button, you may get an error message from time to time stating that the invoice total amount in the Summary tab is different than the total invoice lines amount that's in the Invoice Lines tab, if those amounts happen to be different. So to resolve this, you would just go to the Summary tab, and just ensure that the total amount for the invoice is the same as the total invoice lines amount. And when everything is reconciled, you would click on the Save and Continue button, or Save if you just want this to be in review. And again, now we're put into the payment status, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So going back to the slides, another option for creating an invoice is to create an invoice from an Excel file. And at the point of beginning to create an invoice, so we actually do it the same exact way, clicking on the Create Invoice link from the Acquisitions menu, but this time we're going to select From File. So you select that, click on the Next button, and when you do that, you will see the Invoice From File page display. So from here, you would select the vendor, and you would upload the Excel file. Invoice creation runs at a batch job, and so when that job is completed, staff operators will receive an email notification. Just to help you with the formatting of the Excel file, you can actually download an example from the Invoice From File page. There will be a link, Download Excel Example, and when you do that, this is what you will find. So this is just an example of what you can use to upload Excel invoice information. So we looked at the various ways to create an invoice. I'd mentioned once an invoice is created, if you look at the Fund Transactions tab, as we see in this example, you will see two new transactions appear, a disencumbrance and an expenditure. And let's actually look at this in Alma. So from Alma, now I'm going to go under Acquisitions, scrolling down under Acquisitions Infrastructure, I'm going to Funds and Ledgers. We're going to take a look at the fund that was used for one of these invoices. So the fund that was used was Monographs Humanities, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And in the Transactions tab, this is where I'll see all of the transactions that happened for this particular fund. And let's take a look at one of these. Let's look at PO line 7610, which is one of the invoices we created. So when the item is first initially ordered, it's considered an encumbrance. So in other words, it's money that's reserved for the item. Once the invoice is created, the money is then disencumbered. As we see in this example here, it's disencumbered. And it is then considered or turned into an expenditure. And we see that item right here. And notice that the expenditure, in addition to being able to access the PO line, we can also access the invoice line as well. So going back to the slides. The last way that an invoice can be created is automatically through an electronic data interchange process that's been set up with the vendor. EDI is based on international standards, which were developed under the auspices of the United Nations. For details on EDI standards, you can refer to the EDI Standards Supported in ALMA document, which can be found on the Ex-Libris Documentation Center. To perform invoicing via EDI requires a couple of things. It requires that EDI communication is established with vendors, and it also requires that the parameters for transmission are agreed upon. The vendor record is where EDI communication information is set up. So just to note that the role of vendor manager will be required for a user who is setting up EDI communication in the vendor record. In the EDI information tab of the vendor record, you're going to see three main sections. The vendor EDI attributes section, and this contains the EDI code and indicates what data will be sent via EDI. So in this case, we've said that invoices will be sent via EDI. A job parameters section will appear next, and this indicates scheduling, how often the EDI process will run. So you can schedule it to run regularly at a particularly scheduled time, or you can click on the Run Now button to have it run immediately, or you have an option to upload an EDI file and have it run that way. And then the third section you'll see is for FTP connection information. So you'll want to work with the vendor and your Ex-Libris project team to get all of this set up correctly. To see the EDI job history and files from a vendor, from, again, the vendor area in the acquisitions menu, you would search for the vendor whose EDI jobs you want to see, and then click on Actions and View History. And this will give you the history of when the EDI jobs ran for that vendor, as we see in this example, and if the job completed successfully or if it completed with errors. You can also, from the vendor area, click on Actions, View EDI Files, and that will allow you to view the actual EDI invoice files themselves, perhaps if you need to edit them or delete or download or reload those files. And you can also view a report from there about the EDI processing. So since we've now seen the various ways to create invoices, let's next discuss how to process invoices once they've been created. We're going to start with the review process, then the approval process, and then finally the payment process. So we mentioned that there are invoice review rules that can be configured in ALMA. These rules determine when an invoice needs to go to a review status. Now, typically, invoices are set to a review status if the review rules indicate that manual review is needed, if the Save button is used instead of the Save and Continue button when an invoice is created, or if there are any data issues or alerts that ALMA finds when it tries to process the invoice. So depending on your configuration, once invoices have been created, they may need to be reviewed. So to review invoices, this is done under Acquisitions. Under Receiving and Invoicing, there's a review link. And let's actually go to ALMA to show you this. So before I leave the screen though, you can also access this from the task list. You will see a section for Invoices Review, with or without assignments. In this case, without assignments, it looks like there are 19 invoices that need review. So going to ALMA. So from the ALMA Acquisitions menu, under Receiving and Invoicing, this time we're going to the Review stage. Notice the 3 tabs across the top: Assigned to Me, Unassigned, and Assigned to Others. And so by default, when you click on that link, it will take you to the Assigned to Me tab. So this is the list of invoices that need to be reviewed. We also see the number of alerts for each of the invoices. And we also see, if we go to the right, the number of invoice lines that are associated with the invoice. Also, just to note that as an invoicing manager, invoicing managers have the ability to assign invoices to different staff members as needed. So you can click on Actions, Assign to. Just in terms of the alerts, you can click on the hyperlinked number in the alerts column to see the things that need attention, why it was put into a review status. So let's look at line number 12 here, this invoice, and we'll take a look at, there are 4 alerts for this invoice. So we'll see a description of, again, why this invoice was put into the review status. So I'll click on Back. Another way to see alerts is in the invoice itself. So let's actually go to that invoice. So I'm going to click on Actions and then Edit to access the invoice. And within the invoice, we'll click on the Alerts tab. So this is another way to see the alerts associated with this particular invoice. And the description column here indicates the reasons why an invoice has been sent to the review status. Just some other examples or general examples of the types of alerts that may be generated for invoices. So first of all, there might be a discrepancy in the total amount. So maybe there's a discrepancy between the invoice total amount in the Summary tab and the total of the invoice lines in the Invoice Lines tab. So that could be one example why it might be set to a review status. Another is the invoice might be using a different vendor than the PO line uses. Invoice lines maybe are not linked to PO lines. And then perhaps the invoice is for a high-priced item that needs review before the invoice is sent to the payment stage. So for each of these, you will see either Edit Lines or Edit Invoice. Edit Lines will take you to the specific invoice lines with the issue so that you can resolve it. You would click on Edit Invoice, and that will take you to the Summary tab of the invoice. But notice you can get to the Summary tab very easily from here as well. The invoice or the invoice lines need to be edited to correct the invoice before clicking on the Save and Continue button. And that would move the invoice then to the next step of the workflow. So going back to the slides. The next step in the process after the review process is the optional step for approval. Rules for setting invoices to manual approval are defined in ALMA. So if an invoice meets the criteria defined, then the invoice is set to the approval stage, where an invoicing manager needs to review and approve it before it's then sent to the payment stage of the process. Just some examples of when invoices may need approval are if there are data issues, or perhaps an invoice is for a high-priced item, which needs approval by a manager before it can be paid. The rules can be configured to have an automatic approval for invoices as well. So that would move them automatically to the payment stage, and it basically bypasses the manual approval stage. To approve invoices, a staff operator who has the invoicing manager role would be able to see from the acquisitions menu under receiving and invoices, they'll be able to see an approve link. They'll also be able to see invoices that need approval using their task list as well. And let's go ahead and go to Alma. So now under acquisitions, receiving and invoicing, I'm going to the approval area. And again, notice the 3 tabs across the top. By default, I'll be taken to the Assigned to Me tab. So here I can review as the invoicing manager. I can review the invoice and either approve it or reject it. So I can click on Actions. And also notice I can immediately set it back to a review status if that's what I choose to do. But for approving or rejecting, I would click on Actions, Edit. This will take me to the invoice. So here's the invoice itself. I can review the invoice. I can make any changes as needed. And I can click on then either approve to approve the invoice, and that sends it to the next stage of the process. Or I can reject it. And what I mean by rejecting is I can send it back to the review stage by clicking on Need Additional Review. So that is the approval process. So after the invoice is created and it passes the review stage and the optional approval stage, it's ready for payment processing. Behind the scenes in Alma, it will go through a status called Ready to be Paid, and then ultimately you will see it in Alma as Waiting for Payment. So to view invoices that are sent for payment, that are waiting for payment, you would do this also from the Acquisitions menu under Receiving and Invoicing, by clicking on the Waiting for Payment link. And we'll go ahead and go to Alma and let me show you this. So under Acquisitions, Receiving, and Invoicing, now I'm clicking on Waiting for Payment. And again, we have the 3 tabs across the top. The list of invoices that are, this is basically the list of invoices that are ready to be paid or waiting for payment. So this is the list that displays. It again shows you the number of alerts and the number of invoice lines that are in the invoice. And you'll see the facets on the left-hand side and the Find search box and then the search parameters here. These are basically the same as you would find in the invoice review page and the invoice approval page. So I would click on, for any of these, Actions, and I can select Actions Edit, and that's where I can enter payment details to ultimately close out the invoice. Or from here, I can select Actions, Set Back to Review, and that will send this invoice back into the review stage for further review. In this case, though, I want to indicate payment details, so I'm going to click on Actions, Edit. So here it takes me to the invoice, and I'm automatically, by default, taken to the Summary tab. So we're going to scroll down to the Payment section of the invoice. So this is where we need to set the status, and we need to make sure that status is set to paid. We add the voucher number, we add the voucher date and the voucher amount, and I actually pre-populated all of this information earlier. And then just a note that at this stage, the payment section is the only section that can be edited on the invoice. Notice that the rest of the information on this invoice cannot be edited. And then at that point, I would click on Save and Continue, and that will move it to the next stage in the process. And this is actually will change the invoice's status to paid at that point. And then Alma checks whether the PO lines associated with the invoice are fully invoiced and paid, and if they are, Alma will then close the invoice lines as well as this invoice. Going back to the slide. If you need to search for a closed invoice, the simplest way to retrieve it is to search for it using either the persistent search box and selecting invoicing as the search option, or from the receiving and invoicing section of the acquisitions menu, clicking on search for invoice. And from there, you can actually search for the invoice and then see or view the closed invoice. So this brings us to the end of our session. So just in summary, in this session, we looked at how the invoicing process works in Alma and the options that can be implemented in the workflow. Invoices essentially track payments for resources, and we looked at how there can be a flexible invoice life cycle or process depending on your needs. For example, you may need to have an approval stage, or maybe you want to use EDI to create invoices. So we looked at how to create invoices manually, either manually entering the invoice details, using the PO to create the invoice, or uploading an Excel file with the invoice details, as well as how to review, approve invoices if needed, and then pay invoices. There are several resources that may be useful in helping to develop your understanding of invoice workflows in ALMA, and these documents are available as online help in ALMA, and this will provide the most up-to-date information, or as PDF files on the Ex-Libris Documentation Center. Just to note that there are also hands-on exercises that are available that you can use to practice invoicing workflows in your ALMA sandbox environment. And then lastly, if you're interested in how ERP systems work with the invoice process, more information can be found in the training session, Synchronizing with ERP Systems, as well as the ALMA Integrations with External Systems guide. Thanks for viewing this session.